Howdy folks, and welcome to Saddle and Sixskin, where we spin yarns of the Old West, tales of grit, survival, and maybe a little bit of redemption. If you're anything like me, pushing past 40 or so, you appreciate a good story with some heart, am I right? Well, settle in close to the fire, because this one's a doozy. And hey, before we get started, if you like what you hear, give us a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We'd be mighty grateful. Now, picture this, the snow's comin' down sideways, a relentless blizzard that's got the whole world looking like a blurry white canvas. And right smack in the middle of it, there's this little cabin, barely holding its own against the wind. Inside, huddled by the dying embers of the hearth, sits a woman named Emma Whitlock. She's young, barely out of her teens, but the weariness in her eyes tells a different story. She's staring at those flames like they're the only things keeping her tethered to this world. Can you imagine how isolated she must have felt? All alone out there, the snow trying to bury her alive? The wood box is nearly empty, just a few brittle scraps left to burn. Emma hasn't had a real meal since yesterday morning, maybe a crust of stale bread if you can even call that a meal, and her hands are so weak they tremble whenever she tries to stir the fire. She's only 23, but feels ancient, like her bones already belong to the earth. She's been through so much already. Tonight, she's convinced death might come, not with a bang, but with a whisper, wrapped in the cold silence of the storm. She thinks of her late husband's grave, out there on a hillside, now buried under a thick blanket of snow. And she wonders if she'll soon be lying beside him, nameless and forgotten. Do you think she'll make it through the night? Do you feel the cold deep down to your bones? The storm's voice is heavy, a long, low howl that snakes through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying every cruel whisper she's ever endured. After her husband, Samuel, died, the townsfolk turned on her. They called her cursed, said she married for land, maybe even poisoned him. Some even whispered that her beauty was a snare, a trick of fate that deserved punishment. How hateful is that? To blame a young woman for the misfortunes that befell her? Their eyes followed her every time she dared set foot in the store, sharp and judging, until shame drove her farther and farther from town. Here, in this isolated cabin, she lives like a ghost, speaking to no one, keepin to herself, clinging to survival like a wounded animal. Her pride won't let her beg, even though hunger gnaws at her insides. Silence has become a second skin, a shield against the world's cruelty. Tonight, she tells herself that the end might be easier than another dawn spent alone. What would you do in her situation? How long can one person endure such hardship? Now, if you're enjoying this story of the Old West, please give us a like. It's in that silence that she hears it. At first, she thinks it's just the moan of the storm, but then it repeats, 3 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate, echo through the wood of the door. Emma's breath hitches in her chest. No one comes here, not in winter, not in this kind of weather. Fear surges through her like a sudden fire. Her first thought is of men from town, coming to shame her even further, to strip her of what little dignity she has left. But her second thought is that maybe death itself has come knockin'. She rises on trembling legs, clutching her shawl tighter, and moves toward the door. The knockin' comes again, firmer this time. She presses her palm flat against the wood, as though trying to sense the truth of who's waitin' on the other side. The handle feels like ice under her hand. She hesitates. Her mind races through every warning her father ever gave her about strangers in the wilderness. But something deeper than fear whispers that she can't ignore this. She lifts the latch and pulls the door open. So who do you think it is? What is coming next? What kind of person opens the door? The wind hits her first, a wall of white, whirling flakes that sting her skin. Then she sees them. 3 figures stand there in the snow, broad-shouldered, bare-chested despite the storm. Their dark hair is heavy with frost. They're Apaches, giant men whose presence fills the narrow doorway. Their breath steams in the cold, their eyes are dark and unblinking. For an instant, Emma's heart seizes. Stories of raids and violence, all the rumors the town has fed her, flare bright in her mind. She nearly slams the door shut, but they don't move to enter, nor do they raise weapons. The eldest, with a scar cut across his cheek, steps forward just enough for his voice to be heard over the wind. "Shelter," he says simply, his English rough but steady. His hand doesn't reach for her, only presses briefly against his chest, as though to show his need. Emma's throat tightens. She looks from him to the younger two beside him. One has eyes sharp as a hawk's, the other is restless, shifting his weight as though the cold gnaws at his bones. Snow clings to their skin, to the lines of muscle across their shoulders. They're strong, yes, but she also sees the fatigue in their faces, the raw bite of winter that leaves them no choice but to knock at the door of a stranger. "What would you do? Would you let them in?" "I think I would." A wave of conflict crashes over her. If she lets them in, she risks the wrath of the town, the gossip, maybe even danger to herself. If she turns them away, they'll surely perish in the storm, and she'll be left with the echo of their eyes in her memory. For long moments, she stands in the doorway, the storm whipping around her, her hair blown wild across her face. The silence stretches, broken only by the moan of the wind. Then she remembers her own fear only minutes before, that she might die tonight alone and unseen. Something in her heart breaks at that thought. She can't condemn them to the same. "Come," she whispers, barely audible. She steps back into the dim glow of the cabin. The choice is hers. The three exchange glances, brief, wordless, and then duck low to enter. The eldest moves with a kind of quiet authority, "Guidin," the others passed her without haste, as if to assure her he means no harm. The door shuts against the storm, muffling the world into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the weak fire. Suddenly, the cabin feels smaller, the air thick with the presence of these strangers, their height nearly brushing the beams. Emma presses herself against the wall, her hands clutching the shawl around her shoulders, unsure if she's invited salvation or ruin. They stand without speaking, steam rising from their bodies as the heat of the fire touches them. The youngest rubs his arms briskly, teeth clenched against the cold. The one with the hawk-like gaze watches her with a caution that mirrors her own. The eldest lowers himself near the hearth, extending his hands to the flames, but never taking his eyes off her. Emma's heart pounds in her ears. She thinks of the whispers in town, of Mrs. Rose's voice sharp with scorn, and shame burns hotter than the fire. So did you make the right choice, or will you find ruin? What would they say if they saw her here, alone with 3 Apache men? Yet, the longer she looks at them, the more she sees not danger, but weariness, men stripped down to survival. She moves stiffly to the woodbox, pulling the last 2 logs into her arms, and sets them carefully on the fire. Sparks leap upward, casting the room in golden light, shadows dancing across faces marked by hardship. For the first time that night, the warmth fills not only the air, but her chest. The eldest inclines his head slightly, a gesture so small yet so full of meaning that it startles her. Gratitude without words. Respect where she had expected only demand. It's enough to make her eyes sting. If you are enjoying this video, don't be afraid to subscribe. Emma sinks onto the bench by the table, her body trembling from more than the cold. She can't yet speak. They can't yet explain. But the silence between them is no longer empty. It's a fragile bridge built on the thin thread of mercy. The storm rages outside, battering the walls, but within the cabin, there's only firelight, breath, and the steady knowledge that none of them will face the night alone. Still, fear doesn't leave her. Fear lingers in the space between each heartbeat, whispering of what tomorrow might bring. Yet, beneath it, a different voice begins to rise, softer, steadier, telling her that sometimes survival itself is the first act of trust. She folds her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the flames, and though her lips barely move, she whispers a prayer she hasn't dared speak in months. Let this not be my end. The fire crackles in answer, and when she lifts her eyes, she finds all three of them watching her. Not with hunger, not with threat, but with the same raw plea that carried them through the snow to her door. In that shared look, something passes between them, an unspoken vow that the night won't take them. Emma lowers her gaze, the heat rising in her cheeks, but her heart feels steadier than it has in many winters. She's opened the door once, and though she doesn't yet know what it'll cost her, she doesn't regret it. Emma wakes to the creak of the rafters and the faint light of dawn bleeding through frost-rimmed glass. The storm has dulled to a hush, snow settling heavy against the cabin walls. Her eyes go first to the hearth, where the fire still smolders, then to the three forms stretched on the floorboards, close enough to the heat that their breath rises in steady plumes. How long can they make it against Mother Nature and the hate in the town? Will it be better or worse next time? They look less like intruders in that moment, more like weary men claimed by exhaustion, their stillness softened by sleep. She pulls her shawl tighter and tries to steady the drumbeat of her heart. The air smells of wood smoke and damp leather. One of them, she thinks the youngest, shifts in his sleep, turning his face toward her. She catches the line of his jaw, the tension even in slumber, and a rush of unease stirs in her chest. She turns away quickly, ashamed of her own gaze. She should feel only fear, and yet something quieter settles beneath it, a recognition of need. They came to her door with nothing but desperation, and in giving them a place by the fire, she's entangled her fate with theirs. The eldest stirs first. He rises to a seated position, dark hair fallen forward, and studies her without a word. His eyes aren't demanding, but searching, as though weighing her courage against her fear. She can't look long before glancing away, fussing with the kettle, as though she has something to offer. In truth, she has almost nothing. A scrap of cornmeal, a heel of bread. Shame burns in her as she sets the meager things on the table. Her husband had once promised her plenty, but now she has little more than pride, and even that is threadbare. Without a skin, the eldest crosses the room to his own pack and draws out a strip of dried meat. He sets it on the table beside her bread. The gesture is simple, but it strikes her with such force that her throat tightens. She thinks of the townsfolk who look at her with pity or scorn, but never offer help. These strangers, whom she's been taught to fear, give without hesitation. She manages a nod of thanks, though her voice catches in her throat before words can form. Now, here is another reminder to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin if you enjoy this story. They eat in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space where speech might have been. Emma feels their presence like a weight in the room, yet not an oppressive one, more the weight of eyes upon her, of lives brushing close to hers. She thinks of the town, and how tongues will wag if anyone knew. They already whisper of her solitude, of her shame. To say she's taken in 3 Apache men, bare-chested, wild in appearance, would be to invite ruin. Later, when the snow relents, she steps outside to gather what little kindling she can find. The air bites at her lungs, but it's the stillness that chills her most. Across the white fields, a rider moves at a distance, his figure stark against the drifts. He slows when he sees smoke rising from her chimney. She knows at once what that means. The town will hear of it before nightfall. Her stomach knots with dread. By afternoon, she forces herself to town for flour. The trip is bitter, the snow clinging to her skirts, but it's the eyes that cut deepest. What is going to happen next? What can she say to stop the hate? Inside the store, the gossip has already taken root. Mrs. Agatha Rose's voice carries sharp as a crow's cry. 3 of them, I heard. Savages in her cabin, and she alone with them. Mark my words, nothing good comes of that. The other women cluck their tongues, some with pity, most with venom. Emma keeps her head bowed, clutching the sack of flour, but the heat of their stares burns her neck. She wants to shout that she's only done what mercy demanded, but shame seals her lips. Sheriff Vernon Harlow stands near the door, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. When Emma passes, his eyes linger. Not hostile, not kind, but heavy with warning. He says nothing, and that silence is worse than accusation. She hurries from the store, her cheeks aflame, hearing the murmurs follow her out into the street. If you like this video, hit the like button. The world outside seems colder for their judgment. Back at the cabin, the fire welcomes her, and so does the sight of the three men waiting with quiet patience. None of them ask what has happened in town, though she carries the sting of it on her skin. She busies herself with the flour, mixing it with water to make rough cakes. As she works, she feels their eyes on her, not in suspicion, not in hunger, but in a kind of solemn watchfulness. The eldest, with the scar on his cheek, seems to sense her unease. He takes a piece of wood and sets to repairing the broken latch on the door, his hands steady, his work careful. What is the future of these people? Will the town let them be? The younger two follow in small ways. One fixin' a crack in the wall, the other stackin' wood by the hearth. They give what they can, as though answering her shame with silent acts of dignity. Night falls early. The storm gathers again, whispering against the walls. Emma sits by the fire, her hands folded tight, her mind turning over the faces in town, the voices sharp with scorn. She wonders how long before someone comes knocking, not for shelter, but for judgment. The thought leaves her trembling, and she tries to hide it. Yet, the eldest sees. He rises and drapes a heavy blanket across her shoulders, his hands steady but brief, leaving no trace but warmth. She lifts her eyes to his and finds no threat there, only the same plea she glimpsed the night before. A need for trust, for a place to belong, even for a moment. She wants to speak, to ask why they've come, who they are, what storms drove them beyond her door. But her tongue falters. Perhaps words aren't needed yet. The firelight paints their faces in shifting gold, and she sees not strangers, but men who, like her, carry the weight of being unwanted. What do you think? How does this feel to Emma? Will this bring ruin? In that reflection, her shame softens. She's not the only one judged. Outside, the wind rises, carrying with it faint echoes of voices. Whether memory or imagination, she can't tell. She draws the blanket tighter and closes her eyes against the sound. What is to come in the future? Will she be burned with them? When she opens them again, all three are watching her with the same steady silence, as though they too know the burden of being seen as less than human. Emma's heart swells with fear and something more fragile, something she dares not name. She looks at them and thinks, the town will hate me for this. But in the glow of the fire, with the storm raging just beyond the walls, she also thinks, I'm not alone tonight. The night deepens. The fire hisses and cracks, and though the weight of gossip presses against her door like the snow itself, Emma finds within her a flicker of defiance she hasn't felt in months. It's not loud, not bold, but it's there, steady as the flame. She lets the warmth settle into her bones and whispers to herself that tomorrow will come, and she'll face it. The days that followed carried the weight of hunger. The snow didn't ease, only piled deeper against the cabin walls until the world beyond was little more than a white prison. Emma counted the flour, the small measure of cornmeal, and knew it wouldn't last. Her hands shook as she shaped thin cakes by the fire, their smell a mockery of the emptiness in her belly. She divided them into 4 pieces, setting one before each man and keeping the smallest for herself. She hoped they wouldn't notice, but the eldest, his scar catching the glow of the flames, saw. He slid half of his portion back toward her without a word. What more will she face? She can't get to town anymore. She wanted to refuse, but her body betrayed her, talking it with trembling fingers. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of shared need. The younger two brought forth their own off-errand, strips of dried venison, dark and tough, but fillin. Emma chewed slowly, grateful, her eyes stinging, shame coiled in her chest. She had nothing left to give, nothing but the roof above them and the brittle warmth of her hearth. They had come to her seeking mercy. Yet, it was she who found herself leaning on their strength. Each day survival became their language. Will they make it? Will she live with them in peace? Takakota, the eldest, took the axe and split wood with a steady rhythm, his breath rising in plumes against the cold. Emma watched from the doorway, her shawl tight around her shoulders, marveling at the grace of his movements. The sound of the blade sinking into frozen logs was both frightening and comforting, a reminder that strength could be turned toward protection rather than harm. When he carried the cut wood inside, he placed it near the hearth without lifting his eyes, as though he wished to make the offering without drawing attention. Niati, the one with hawk-sharp eyes, turned his hands to mending. He patched the roof where snow seeped through, nailed loose boards, and stuffed rags into the cracks of the walls. His silence was heavy, but Emma felt its weight less as days passed. What is to become of this unlikely group? Can they truly be friends? There was gentleness in his caution, as though he measured each action carefully to avoid frightening her. Once, when she struggled to lift a bucket of water from the melting pot, he stepped forward and took it from her hands. Their fingers brushed quick as a spark, and she drew back, her face burning. He said nothing, only set the bucket down as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Koana, restless and younger, taught her to set snares in the thicket just beyond the cabin. Together they braved the snow, his hands steadying her when she stumbled. Are you enjoying the story? Please like the video. She felt foolish, clumsy in the drifts, but he showed patience, crouching low to demonstrate how to tie the wire, how to mask the scent. When they returned with a rabbit struggling in the trap, Emma's stomach knotted at the sight. Yet, hunger urged her to harden her heart. Koana killed it swiftly, with reverence more than cruelty. And when they cooked it over the fire that night, she tasted something she hadn't felt in months. Relief. Evenings were quiet. The men spoke little, their words in a tongue she only half understood, but their gestures told more than speech. They left her the place closest to the fire. They never reached for her or crowded her, though the cabin was small. Their restraint, their careful distance grew into a fragile trust. Emma felt herself breathing easier, though unease never wholly left her. She knew the world beyond wouldn't forgive what happened inside these walls. One evening, as the snow fell with a softness that belied its weight, Emma sat sewing a tear in her dress. Can the two sides trust each other, or is there more to come? The thread was thin, the fabric worn, yet her hands moved with practiced care. She sensed eyes on her and looked up to find the three watching. Not with desire, not with scorn, but with something steadier, as though the simple act of mending cloth was to them a sign of endurance. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she bent lower over her work. When the needle pricked her finger, a bead of blood welled bright against pale skin. Before she could wipe it away, Takakota reached across the table, offering a strip of cloth. Their fingers brushed again, and this time, she didn't pull back so quickly. She pressed the cloth to her wound, whispering thanks. And in that hush, she felt the bond tightening, not in leaps, but in small threads. Yet shame was never far. What is next? Can she truly live with these people? On her next trip to town for salt, whispers followed her like shadows. She heard Mrs. Rose's voice behind her, "There she goes, the widow who keeps company with savages." The words pierced sharper than frost. Emma's hands shook so badly she dropped the tin she carried, and laughter rippled from the women nearby. She gathered it quickly, cheeks blazing, and fled the store. The ride home was long and bitter. Is this how it always will be? How could you withstand such hate? When she reached the cabin, she stood outside a moment, clutching her shawl, afraid they'd see the humiliation written on her face. But when she entered, she found the men at work, Koana stirring the fire, Niati carving a handle for the axe, Takakota stacking the last of the wood. They looked up at her with quiet acknowledgement. What is to come, in the future? Is the town ready to accept them all? No questions, no judgment. Something in her heart cracked open. For the first time in months, she felt safer here with those the world despised than in the town she had once called her own. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, watching its glow fade to embers, listening to the slow breathing of the men nearby. A thought pressed into her chest like a blade: she was no longer alone. And here is the last reminder to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The world outside might condemn her, but in this small circle of firelight, there was belonging, however fragile. She whispered into the dark, more to herself than to God, "Let this last. Is it time for the sheriff? Is it time for the law? Is the story coming to an end?" The next day, a fist heavy with authority. Emma froze, the poker slipping from her fingers to clang against the stones. The three men glanced toward the door, their bodies tensing. Takakota rose first, his face unreadable, and gave her a look that was both question and warning. Her throat closed. She moved past him, clutching her shawl, and lifted the latch. Is it finally over? The cold rushed in with the sheriff. Vernon Harlow stood tall, his coat dusted with frost, his eyes sharper than the edge of a blade. Behind him loitered half a dozen townsmen, their faces hard, their boots crunching in the snow. Some carried rifles slung across their backs. Others, the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from sniffing scandal. Emma's stomach dropped as she recognized Mrs. Rose's husband among them, his jaw set like stone. What is to come for Emma? What is to come for her family? Emma Whitlock, the sheriff said, his voice slow and heavy. Word is, you've taken in company. She opened her mouth, but no words formed. Behind her, the fire cracked, the silence stretching thin. Takakota stepped into the sheriff's view, followed by Nyati and Koana. They did not raise weapons, nor did they bare their teeth. They stood like carved figures, unflinching, their dark eyes fixed on the intruders. What will come from this moment? Can she save them all? A murmur rippled through the men outside. One spat into the snow, just as we heard. She's thrown in with them. Shame washed over Emma, hot and suffocating. She could feel their stares like knives, carving her down to nothing. The air was thick with judgment, with the weight of every whispered story she'd endured multiplied tenfold. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the floorboards. Yet, she felt the warmth of the fire at her back. And in that warmth, she sensed the steady presence of the three who had asked nothing but shelter. What can they do to resolve the violence? Can she stand alone? They've harmed no one, she managed at last, her voice raw. They came here with the storm, near frozen. I gave them fire. Nothing more. Nothing more. Mrs. Rose's husband sneered. A young widow alone in a cabin with three half-naked savages? You expect us to believe that? Emma's cheeks burned. Her lips parted, but no defense came. Every word seemed feeble in the face of their certainty. She looked to the sheriff, hoping for a scrap of mercy. His eyes, weathered by years of carrying the law, flickered with something, hesitation perhaps, but he said only, "It ain't right, Emma. Folks are stirred up. They want these men gone." Takakota moved then, slow as a mountain shifting. He stepped forward, raising his hands slightly, palms open to show peace. His gaze locked on the sheriff's, steady and unyielding. In the stillness of that gesture, Emma felt her shame collide with dignity. He wouldn't beg, nor would he lash out. He stood as if to say, "We are men, not beasts." Her breath caught. Something in her snapped, the long chain of silence she'd worn since Samuel's death, the weight of whispers that had bent her spine. What is going to happen? Can they get out of this peaceably? What do you think will happen next? She stepped forward until she stood beside Takakota, her shoulders squared though her heart thundered. "They saved me," she said, the words trembling but clear. "When I had nothing, when no one in town cared if I froze or starved, they shared what little they had. I won't see them driven out into the snow. How can this end? Can she be the voice of change?" Gasps broke among the men. One swore under his breath. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as though gauging the strength in her voice. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the sheriff turned, surveying the faces of the townsmen. "Go on home," he said, his voice low but firm. "There will be no trouble here today." Rose barked, "You'd let this stand? You'd let her shame us all?" The sheriff's eyes cut to him, hard as flint. "I said, go home." Murmurs rose, angry and dissatisfied, but one by one they turned away, trudging back through the snow with curses muttered under their breath. Only the sheriff lingered, his gaze heavy on Emma. At last, he spoke. "You've made your choice, Emma Whitlock. I hope you know what it'll cost you." Then he pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the white silence, leaving her with the sound of boots fading into the distance. Emma closed the door slowly, her hands trembling against the wood. The latch clicked into place, and with it came a rush of air, as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. She turned, pressing her back against the door, and met the eyes of the three men. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but the firelight showed something softer in their faces, a recognition of her courage, however small. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the bench. What is going to happen to her now? Tears welled, hot and unbidden, spilling before she could stop them. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed of her own collapse after standing so firm. A shadow fell over her, and then the weight of a blanket settled across her shoulders. Takakota's hand lingered only a moment, heavy and steady before retreating. She drew the fabric close, her tears soaking into its weave. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt she had spoken not as a widow, not as a woman beaten down by shame, but as herself. The price would be high. She knew the town's cruelty well. And so please subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. But as she lifted her eyes to the three silent figures before her, she also knew she was no longer standing alone. Outside, the snow began again, fine and relentless, whispering against the cabin walls. Emma stared into the fire, her breath unsteady, her heart both heavy and unburdened. The judgment had come, and though it hadn't yet destroyed her, she sensed it would return. Still, in the quiet that followed, she allowed herself to believe that strength could grow from such trials. She whispered into the flickering silence, barely loud enough for herself, "So be it." The storm returned with a vengeance, roaring down from the hills as though the sky itself sought to bury the earth in white silence. What does the future hold? Do we know if we are to see better days or a darker tomorrow? Emma stood at the window, watching snow whip across the fields, her breath clouding the glass. The sheriff's warning still rang in her ears. She had spoken her truth, yet it had only drawn the town's anger closer. She pressed her shawl to her chest, wondering how much longer the fragile peace could hold. Behind her, the three men moved about the cabin with the calm efficiency of wolves preparing for night, stacking wood, sharpening blades, checking the door's new latch. Their silence carried both patience and anticipation, as though they too knew what? That what? Judgment was not finished. When the first flicker of torch light appeared beyond the drifts, Emma's heart stumbled. She leaned closer to the glass, straining to believe she was wrong. But more followed, orange flames moving through the snow, carried by men trudging forward with grim purpose. Can they stand and defend themselves now? She counted at least a dozen, their shadows bending long against the storm. Fear flooded her, cold as the wind that rattled the shutters. "They've come back," she whispered. The three exchanged glances, no words needed. Takakota took position by the door, his hand steady on the axe handle. Niati checked the rifle propped by the wall, though his gaze slid to Emma, waiting for her choice. What is she to choose? What is she to do? Koana slipped to the window, his jaw tight, his body coiled with restless energy. Emma's throat closed, her pulse thrumming like a drum. It would be so easy to collapse under the weight of dread, to hide behind silence again. But she thought of the sheriff's words, of Mrs. Rose's sharp tongue, of every moment she had bowed her head in shame. And she thought of these three who had asked nothing but warmth, who had given more to her survival than the town ever had. She wouldn't let them be hunted like beasts. A pounding shook the door, louder than the storm. What do you think? Can she continue to defend? Open up, Emma Whitlock, a voice bellowed. You've had your chance. Send them out, or we'll drag them out ourselves. Her hands trembled. She stepped closer to the fire, her shadow wavering against the wall. What do they want? She asked, though she already knew. Takakota's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. They carried no fear, only a question: would she stand with them? Emma swallowed hard. She turned toward the door, her voice rising above the storm. Go home. You've no claim here. They've done no harm. Laughter rose outside, cruel and sharp. No harm? You shame us all, woman. Well, see this ended. The latch rattled under heavy blows. The wood groaned. Koana bristled, his hand tightening on his knife, but Takakota lifted a hand, holding him back. What will her decision be? What is going to happen next? Emma watched, her breath shallow, as the door shuddered under another strike. At last, it gave, swinging inward with a crash, snow and torch lights spilling into the cabin. The men poured through, faces twisted by fury, rifles and clubs raised. What is to come? What followed blurred into fire and shadow. The Apaches moved not with rage, but with restraint, their bodies a shield around Emma. Takakota swung the axe's blunt end to knock a man sprawling into the snowdrift outside. Niati wrested a rifle away, breaking it against the doorframe before shoving its wielder out into the storm. Koana darted like quicksilver, striking with the flat of his blade, never cutting deep, but always driving the attackers back. Their strength was fierce, yet tempered, as if each act carried a vow not to take life unless forced. Emma pressed against the wall, terror rising in her throat. Here is the ending. Flames guttered as a torch struck the floor, and she stamped it out with her skirts, smoke curling up into the rafters. A man lunged for her, eyes blazing with hatred, and for an instant, she felt the old helplessness seize her. But before his hand closed on her arm, Takakota drove him back, his body a wall between them. You have almost made it to the end, and I'm sure you would give us a like. Enough. Emma's voice tore from her, raw and desperate. She stepped forward into the fray, her arms spread wide. The men froze, startled by the force in her tone. Snow swirled through the open doorway, flames casting the room in violent light. She stood with her back to the three, facing the intruders who glared at her with contempt. Her heart pounded, but she did not falter. What now? Is this the end? You'll not take them, she said, voice shaking but unbroken. They are under my roof, and I'll not see them thrown to the cold like dogs. If you burn this cabin, you burn me with it. For a long moment, silence held. The storm outside seemed to hush, as if the world itself listened. The townsmen shifted, uncertain, their anger blunted by the sight of her, frail, stubborn, trembling yet unyielding. Then the sheriff's voice cut through, "That's enough." He stepped into the doorway, his coat whipped by the wind, his rifle slung but untouched. His gaze swept the room from the chaos of overturned chairs to Emma's defiant stance to the three silent men behind her. His jaw tightened, the decision weighing heavy. "Go home," he told the crowd, his tone iron. "There will be no blood spilled tonight." They protested, voices rising in disbelief. But the sheriff's stare silenced them. One by one, they lowered their weapons, muttering curses as they retreated into the storm. The torches vanished into the snow until only darkness and wind remained. Emma's knees gave way, and she sank onto the bench, her breath ragged. The door swung shut with a hollow thud. The cabin smelled of smoke and sweat, the air thick with the echo of violence. She lifted her eyes to the three men. They stood still, their chests heaving, their faces carved with exhaustion. Yet in their silence, she read something deeper: respect, not only